Hey,
Hello, I'm here with Mike Watson, co-host of Theorize and Be Damned. Is that the what podcast name now?
that's a podcast of Revolt Press, yeah, Theorize and Be
Yeah,
Damned.
yeah. Co-publisher at Revo Press, technically my editor, and author of several books for both Zero and now one for Revo. And the book we're talking about today is Hungry Ghost in the Machine. And your new book for Revo, Hungry Ghost in the Machine, is kind of a exploration of the intersection of capitalism and let's say electronic identity. That's how I would put it. But um, how do you think capitalist dynamics is affecting the way people present themselves online, which is just, the major theme of the book. So we'll just start there.
Okay, yeah. Well, it is a lot about how people present themselves, but also how they try and deal with the conditions of being, which are certainly exacerbated by capitalism. So we have a situation where, as people, we tend to try and fill an emotional void or cover over the reality of life and death. So we do that through consumerist kind of attempts at satiation through consumerism in various forms. And that's long been the case. And even prior to that, there were other ways to try and evade reality through religious belief or magic ritual or what have you. But today, the specific challenge we have is the speed at which the object which satiates you, i.e., that could be a meme or image on the internet, video. It could be people responding to your posts on social media. That satiation is very short lived. So we're in a constant loop of struggling to then re kind of cover over again the essential despair that we feel. So I mean, it's kind of existential in a way, although I don't mention any existential theorists, but it goes into those kind of themes that are not very often talked about in our kind of broader left wing, very online socialist circles.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised when I was reading your book that you start off with a quote by Jung, um, and and you do make an observation that I want to have you tease out a little bit, where you pick up on the idea of the opium of the masses, uh, and you tie it to both spirituality and addiction, and you talk a little bit about Mark Fisher's depressive hedonia as opposed to ahedonia a bit. And I wanted you to like tease out the way those concepts interact in your analysis of the way people interact online in response to capitalism.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, there's quite a lot going on in the book, as there
Hmm.
often are in my generally very short books, but somehow they seem to they pack a lot in, and then I get to the point of recounting what I said, and it's not always easy. Um, but yes, it starts with Jung, and actually, I've had other people say that was a surprise. Of course, Jung has been somewhat co-opted by the right wing. If you think about the figure of Jordan Peterson, but I wouldn't take him as a right wing thinker particularly. Um, he's not actually used that much in the book. There's literally a quote in the beginning of the book, and I think I refer to his concept of synchronicity later on. But the quote I start with is addiction is the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. So addiction is a spiritual thirst for wholeness. I think we have to be a little bit careful using terms like spirituality unless we hedge it with Hegelianism and say, well, spirit essentially is material, and then it gets a little bit less woolly. So that's that. Without mentioning Hegel, that is kind of where the book goes. It's a strong socialist message that also talks about spirit in terms of a healthiness, or what would be called colloquially a well-being. Um, and Fisher is referred to at several points in the book, partly because Fisher talks about this contradiction, whereby psychology it encourages a notion that we can simply just will ourselves into a better position. Okay. And it's actually very dangerous because it's almost like, well, if you can't do it, then you just it's your own fault. Okay. So it actually comes about with good intentions. So that, we have got the tools to, psychology would have it, we have the tools to improve our situation. But if you go too far down that route, you get into a kind of magical thinking whereby what actually is called by David Smale,
Yeah.
voluntarism, which actually Fisher picked up on this term and used it himself. Magical voluntarism is just a mechanism by which you just wish yourself into a better position, and it runs throughout therapies actually. So I use that, and I point out that whilst the online realm actually exacerbates a lot of our problems, so we go to the online realm feeling anxious, we go there to somehow feel, to feel better, to feel satiated, to feel more complete. We generally end up feeling less complete. It creates a cycle of anxiety. So we might go there. We want approval from posting selfies, from posting kind of wishy-washy spiritual messages. We're not even immune in our circles because we might want approval from posting about Adorno or Marx. So you post your kind of smart message about Adorno, or one posts their message, could be me, in fact, and you kind of think, well, am I going to get, am I going to get much adoration off that? Am I going to get likes from C. Derek Varn and Matt McManus? So I think we're all kind of guilty of it, however logical we think we are. And it's very short-lived, that moment of relief when you get people responding in a positive way to your messages. So you end up chasing it again and again, and that actually causes more anxiety. And where people sometimes end up is having their head kind of done in by this negative cycle online. Is they end up going online again to look for spiritual answers. So meditation courses, advice from spiritual Instagram stars or YouTube stars. And a lot of that advice is actually very dangerous. So it partly really messes up the synchronicity mechanism, or what Jung calls synchronicity, which means kind of meaningful coincidences which might guide you through your life. But there's kind of a hard scientific version of this, and there's kind of a more fluffy spiritual version. And Jung puts himself very much on the fence. He's not very clear what he really means ever, because he has to speak like a scientist, because he was effectively a scientist, but he obviously has strong spiritual leanings. So you could take synchronicity to mean basically there are kind of signs coming spiritually in your life. So you keep seeing a certain animal or pictures of a certain animal that could be your spiritual animal, your spirit animal. That's how it would be portrayed in New Age circles. But there's a kind of harder scientific version, and it's not kind of spirit animals or angels trying to communicate through numbers or animals or what have you, images of animals or what have you. It's just that there are coincidences which carry meaning for individuals, and it's completely down to the individual. There's not any kind of spiritual force trying to communicate with you, but there's no doubt that there are very strong coincidences that we all see in our lives. And synchronicity can, in that case, mean it's literally a coincidence, but you can choose to take that as meaningful and make it part of your narrative, even in the meaningless universe. So this can be actually quite useful. But one of the synchronicities that comes up a lot now online is linked to numerology. So you have these currents of meaning found in numbers, that go back to they have their roots in religion, in ancient spiritual practices and religions. But there are just very crude readings of the meaning of numbers, and what numbers might represent in your life. So one famous one is 1111 or 1111. So these are called angel numbers. Okay, so by certain kind of New Age influencers and New Age kind of spiritualists, they'll say that these are your angel numbers. So it's your angels trying to speak to you. So if you keep seeing 1111 on your clock, and maybe on till receipts in another context, then whatever you're thinking at the time when you see it, that's your angel trying to give you a sign about that thing you're thinking of. So if you're thinking of breaking up with your partner, and every time you see 1111 when you're thinking it, then that's a sign, that's a positive path. The thing is, once you get into Googling this kind of thing, obviously it's going to keep coming back at you. So you're going to keep seeing 1111 because the algorithm's going to keep feeding it to you. and there are other angel numbers like 333, 777, and actually it's very haphazard. Like there's not actually a single meaning. So there's also where it's dangerous because you can start googling this stuff as somebody who's genuinely, you know, mentally insecure, and you're getting all kinds of different meanings. You're going to keep googling till you get the right meaning, perhaps. So this is just going to lead to an explosion in these numbers coming back at you through Google and through your social media. So yeah, I basically talk about how this kind of screws up with our sign system.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about gematria, which is the Jewish system of that, and how it's been decontextualized in like TikTok.
Okay.
So um, i- a lot of gematria has to do with in the fact that like in Semitic and in early Roman languages, letters are numbers. I mean, they are. And so the assumption wasn't, I mean, it's kind of botched, but it wasn't as weird. And then your book had me thinking about, oh yeah, the moment you start plugging this into your algorithm, it's going to give more of it to you. Particularly if you do it on a social media algorithm, like that's how they operate. So there's going to be a mutually enforcing feedback loop of paranoia. Um, and I was thinking about all kinds of weird, uh, you know, like I've messed up my algorithms doing research for things, and then all of a sudden I'm getting the most bizarre shit in my feed. Um, so if you are given to a certain kind of fluffy synchronicity and you're not thinking about the setup of these online communication systems, it can seem like you're actually, getting positive feedback on this weird interpretation of ancient magic. And no, it's just the algorithm kind of feeding you what you want. So yeah, that's an interesting set of problems about the way uh, mental instability and confirmation bias can be like almost leveraged against you by these capitalist firms to give you what you want. I do want to ask you a question about Fisher though, because I've always found Fisher's thinking around David Smells to be a little bit hard for me to understand. And the reason why is Fisher's stuff around like democracy as joy and Corbynism seemed to me to be out of sync with his insights from Smells. And I wanted to ask you what you didn't write about that in the book, but I want to ask you what you make of that, because a lot of his stuff around social democracy as a means of getting beyond stuff like the perils of capitalist mental health care, always seemed to me actually voluntaristic itself. So I wanted to see what your take on that was.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, going back to smells. So we're talking about basically the risk that wellness practices and psychotherapy and psychological practices lead you down the path of thinking you can manifest, a better reality. Now, Fisher did get this moment of extreme positivity and whether it was tipping into mania, I don't know, when Corbyn first emerged as popular and as a figure that was really motivating young people in England. And I think it was around that point he started a Facebook page called Summer is Coming.
Yep.
And so there were lots of posts that just said things like Summer is Coming, and there were some political posts as well, but the whole Summer is Coming was a thing of there was going to be a new bright movement and counterculture in England, and it was going to be based around Corbyn. Um, yeah, and what year was that? Was it far off his support for Russell Brand when Russell Brand went on Newsnight?
Yeah, it was so yeah. I mean, it was interesting to me
Well,
because at the time when we published the Vampire Castle piece, which is one of the many pieces of support for Russell Brand, um, uh, I didn't realize that was actually a signification of what was going to be a change in his politics. Um, and in retrospect, if you like look at Democracy is Joy and those essays, which come out after that. It was actually a major shift in Fisher's politics. So I think it was about 6 months after the Vampire Castle piece that we saw this.
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, I know Corbyn went and addressed the Glastonbury crowd. You know, there's a big festival in England called the
Mm,
Glastonbury Festival, which has been going since the 70s. And that made, I mean, that was just a moment where it just became apparent that Corbyn was embodying or perhaps fronting something that we hadn't imagined possible, that there could be a kind of young adult movement that was very moved by democratic socialism, and it could encompass music because it happened to be a festival and he was speaking out. And you've got football crowds as well chanting for Corbyn. So it seemed like something could happen, but I think that most people who've watched British politics for as long as Fisher has, and myself, and I'm a fair few years younger than he would be now. We tend to be quite cynical and think, well, that's not going to happen because the government's going to shut it down because they're just so good at shutting down, potential, potentially incendiary left-wing movements in the UK. I mean, I think that America and Britain, they have an edge on most of the world in this, which is why you don't see massive uprisings. Um, So I was a lot more cynical than Fisher. I actually left some kind of sarcastic comments on his Facebook thread, and I mean, I used to be in contact with him anyway, but I don't think we really had it out, in any between us in private chats. Um, but yeah, what you identify is actually very smart, and I hadn't really looked at it exactly like that. But Fisher did seem way over positive about some things, and he seemed to drop his normal cool remove, because I would have taken him before that to be a little bit of a slightly edgy leftist that wasn't going to be moved by all this stuff. He was a bit more in the accelerationist camp, but accelerationism which kind of develops of its own accord. That he wasn't in the camp of, hey, let's have a street movement, and anything's possible. So I would say that he had mood fluctuations possibly, although I'm not that close to him to know that, but it seems a bit like that because his thinking kind of it took on emotional currents. And the whole Russell Brand thing, I think, was very mistaken. It seemed from my own point of view, again being British, when Brand went on Newsnight, because it came from Russell Brand going on Newsnight. I think probably your audience are very familiar with this whole scenario, but Brand went on Newsnight and he said to Jeremy Paxman, who's actually was a very talented news anchor, who used to hold people to account. Seriously, he said, like, we need a revolution, and he kind of, he used it as this kind of moment, almost similar to the Sex Pistols on the BBC many years ago,
mhm.
when they got very rude and antagonistic towards this very stuffy um, BBC host. I think he kind of wanted to turn it into that moment. So he kept pushing Paxman on this thing that we need a revolution. But anyone who's followed Brand's work knows that he's far off having any idea on how to have a revolution. And this is even before he kind of took this populist turn, right wing turn that he seems to have taken in last couple of years. So there was a kind of a big debate in England then between me and everyone I really knew about, between the people who were like, wow, someone has to say it, brilliant. We're so glad Brand just went on TV and said the thing you have to say. Then the other people were just like, well, this isn't going to get us a revolution at all. And it's really sad that it's been said by Brand in this way, that's very populist and it's kind of absorbed the energies of many people who should be thinking about revolution, but it's just completely distracted them, you know. So it was kind of surprising to see Fisher very embroiled in that. And yes, it is a bit like, hey, we want a revolution, so let's just make it happen. There's enough of us who want one. That's the kind of vibe you get. That's the vibe I got from around that Brand moment, and later on the Corbyn moment, and the way that Fisher was talking about that there was nothing of, apart from Fisher, in his actual intellectual work, but there's nothing about that whole scene that had the sense of people willing to really do the work, so that's
Mhm.
why it fizzled out.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about, reading your book last week. I was thinking about the implications for Fisher because um, I have come to see the Vampire Castle piece as an indication of a major change in his thought that I think is actually underexplored. And people focus on his condemnation of identity politics, and particularly they read it, unfortunately, in an American context and not in a British one, which doesn't help. But there's actually a pretty big shift in that essay where I think when he's talking about the problems of ultra leftism, which he links to identity politics, as you know, just telling working class people, no, you can't do this. And I read that now very differently than I read it when we published that essay. And I read that now as somewhat, I think I might, be one of the only people who reads it this way, but as Fisher arguing with himself, that part of the people that he's seeing as the Vampire Castle is his, some of the things he said about social democracy and capitalist realism. And he's not directly like saying, I changed my mind. He is putting it in this amalgamated, vampires invading the castle. But one of those vampires happens to look like a younger him. So, which I laugh. I actually don't find it funny because I think it has dire consequences
Well,
ultimately.
yeah, I get the feeling it's a little bit like we could all do better, and then it got
Mm.
taken as him berating people. Yeah, I can agree with you there. Yeah, that does make sense.
This brings us to the Nietzsche and the nihilism of shitposting, and to get we have, I think we have moved on the left from an under criticism of Nietzsche to an over criticism of Nietzsche. Yeah, of course. Nietzsche was a reactionary thinker, but I think admitting that does not mean that everything he said was useless, or that anyone who's ever cited him is somehow secretly a fascist. So I found that interesting because despite all that, I think even the debates about Nietzsche on both sides actually illustrate something about the nature of ressentiment and the way that operates. So I wanted to ask you about the way ressentiment seems to play in shitposting, because it definitely seems to be a an addictive thing that you see online. I know that I've fallen into it personally, so just stirring up shit to do it.
For sure, yeah, for sure. Not for sure that you've fallen into it, but as you say, you have. I'll take that to be the case. But for sure, that is a general problem we experience. I don't generally write about much, so I don't think I'm also guilty of, to be honest. I mean, it depends on the context, of course, and what is exactly what I'm saying. Um, but yeah, there has been a reignited debate about whether the left should speak about Nietzsche, but I think that may be a little bit distorted, because I'm not sure Daniel Tutt was actually full against the left talking about Nietzsche. No, he was just saying that it needs to be done a bit differently.
Yeah, he wasn't. And I'm not sure Lacerdo was either. You
Yeah,
know, and I mean, I do think certain Nietzschean ideas have been decontextualized by the left in a way that's problematic. But and there's certain
yeah,
elements
I
of Nietzschean
think,
thought that
yeah.
we.
Well, there's a risk of us losing sight of the fact that he was indeed very right wing. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
so. But it doesn't help that he says many contradictory things, and then you have to just find a strong current running through his work. And that strong current, to me, doesn't seem to be that he's right wing. There are other more interesting things I would pick up on. I just think he's brilliant he's brilliant in terms of metaphysics and aesthetics even more. And it's what he offers us in terms of aesthetics I find really useful. And I think a lot of us inherit, Nietzsche as a valid figure via the Frankfurt School,
Mhm.
so we don't even question it. And yeah, I think okay, when we should look at the roots of this, because of course, I suppose if you forget the roots, then they can kind of reroot or take root again in obnoxious ways. I suppose we do have to be careful what we're dealing with. But I don't see that as a particularly big risk when you're dealing with this issue of resentment, which is very useful for the left, because the left suffers a lot from resentment. So I think basically we're obviously all very insecure beings. To be human is to be insecure, and we try and cover over that in different ways. And one is religious practice, so prayer. And the funny thing with prayer, if you're praying in front of an idol, is that you often become as still as the idol. So your fear is death or irrelevance or frailty, and so you pray in front of a statue, and then in praying in front of the statue, you become mostly immobile, and you become as lifeless as a statue itself. Arguably, this is the kind of argument Nietzsche would make, and he says that's what's so very dangerous about the Christian faith, which he had a personal bugbear with, because his dad was a minister who died horribly, I think, quite young. But yes, how does this manifest in today's use of the internet? Well, I think it's a similar thing where we try and assert our kind of, life as kind of, vital living beings that are not about to die in any sense. We try and do that through posting to make ourselves stronger. So we'll post to try and get more popular, basically, in whatever sense that means. So whether you're somebody who's posting selfies because you potentially, perceivably attractive, or you're somebody posting critical messages or spiritual messages. And in the posting, we're very static. So we're a bit like people praying in front of idols. Whilst we talk very big, we need revolutions. We're actually doing anything but. We've actually been reduced to, just still slightly kind of moving beings in front of our keyboards. And I think actually, if you're very angry, you can see that kind of image even more. If somebody's posting very angrily, because they tense up in that way. It's almost like a kind of rigor mortis, which links to an
Mm.
image actually of Adorno and Horkheimer's in Dialectic of Enlightenment, when they talk about the anger of the dictator. If you look at the grimace of Hitler as he's giving his speech is that he almost becomes exactly what he's not trying to be. He tenses that up in a kind of rigor mortis like position, and that's the kind of the tension that you get from fascism and other kind of angry political forms for Adorno. And I think you can kind of see that in the figure of the very angry political meme poster or tweeter. So that's basically how I would see that, and I think that is very useful coming from Nietzsche.
Yeah, I definitely see. I was thinking about the obviousness of resentment. I mean, you mentioned the extreme cases in the very beginning of the essay, which is like incel, manosphere posting. Um, and when I talk to people who have, like, I've talked to people who are addiction specialists who also work with incels, and they're really, really hard to reach because the resentment has just piled up and makes almost all interventions suspect, um, and all hope suspect. And I do worry about that. I teach young people. I teach people who are between 15 and 18 years old, and um, the amount of like resentment language that you see in young people, even in very young people, if you look at the way that like kids in the United States are interacting with teachers, uh, you see a lot of what I would consider justified resentment that comes out in unjustified ways. Like uh, the anger just bleeds out and it attacks the people who are the closest emblems of authority for teachers, women, etc., but who are not the actual authorities who are ruining these kids' lives. Um, and so what I started thinking about from your book was how this was already kind of innate in online culture. It's just now it's ubiquitous. Like this is one of the things we always talk about, how the online world isn't real life, but in some ways I'm like, yeah, but it presages it. A lot of stuff that you see online, you're going to see in person eventually.
Mhm.
Um, so I wanted to know what you made of that, considering that trend seems to be intensifying.
Yes. Well, yeah, you do see this resentment and the kind of displacement of the resentment onto the wrong themes and wrong figures for sure. Yeah, that's totally pervasive in the in the populist right-wing realm, like the anti-mask movement and the anti-vax movement, and it feels a lot like "fuck you, I won't do what you tell me" type sentiment, which it kind of burns itself out. There's nothing else coming from it. Um, so yeah, and I think things that are online often appear in reality, but also, the online realm is real in its moment. It has a real consequence. So all of that energy is going online, but again, the actual people engaging are not, they're not being very energetic, or the energy is not being consumed in any useful and healthy way. So I mean, I actually think in terms of posture, um, when you're writing, if you're angry, when you're typing, that's already a bad thing. They're probably damaging themselves just from sitting there angrily typing. Um, but it's to have a huge kind of reserve of resentment and just to be chucking it at a screen is a very dangerous thing. Um, it's probably one of the biggest problems we have today, I think.
Yeah, I think it's highly distorting, if nothing else. And I would say I definitely see it more pronouncedly on the populist right, but it seems culturally ubiquitous. Like I think we know plenty of leftists who are like
Yeah, yeah,
screaming with resentment now. Like,
it goes both ways. Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, it's looking at the US election is very confusing. It's confusing how the vote is so close. But then, if you look at it, it's not like there's been much reach out. There's been some very silly platitudes and efforts by Kamala Harris, so she will have like an all-party, advisory board in the government if she wins. But that's not really a way of reaching out. It's not genuinely a way of reaching out between, the populist right and the id pol left, or vice versa. You can imagine if there's going to be any reach out, it should be coming from the id pol left to the populist right. But people are just very consumed with their resentments, so there's no real way of people communicating. You know?
yeah, I mean, one of the fascinating things about the United States is you always hear that we're super, super polarized, and we are. But if you look at what we're polarized over, it's vibes. Like, um, the actual policies between Biden and Trump, there are differences, and they're not totally insubstantial. But even if you were to compare the policy difference between, like, say, uh, Goldwater and Nixon, are who were on the ostensibly the same party, there were bigger differences than between Biden and Trump, and I think that leads to this weird sense of like uh, there's no addressing the needs. I mean, for example, um, yeah, you don't live in the UK anymore, but you're from there and you know about like the Norse degeneration. Well, we have like swaths of our country that's basically the same. Not as severe because we're not having the same economic problems that Britain is. But Alabama has very little social infrastructure. Uh, a lot of the Mountain West has very little social infrastructure. In the places that do have it, they have it from religious institutions. Like I live in a place that has decent social infrastructure, but it's from the Mormon Church. So like then when you go to a place like California and there's pretty good social infrastructure, but there's like the only people there who can access it are either the very poor or the extremely wealthy. It it is just socially distorting. Um, so if the ID poll left wanted to reach out to the right, the best thing they could do is be like, we can help you build social infrastructure if you get over your racism. But that's never been on the table at all.
That's
It's
true. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think sometimes things are just not seen as left wing issues
mhm.
because it's not the left principally talking about them. So in Finland, we have an issue of language and the apparent kind of, well, the fact that Finnish language is less and less spoken. There are more and more immigrants coming in that are not learning Finnish, and it's a very difficult language. So I don't know Finnish. I know some very basic Finnish after 6 years here, whereas when I lived in Italy, I learned Italian in a couple of years. And one issue is that Finns speak English very well, so it's kind of hard to find a moment to practice with people. But in any case, there is there's a kind of strong critical tendency from the right in the media now, um, and I think the left could really benefit. What's missing here is no one's teaching us. There's no community vibe. Finland is a place where people tend to be very kind of insular. So it's not like you're going to meet people who are like, "Hey, I'll help you learn," but also the government provision of language tuition is only for unemployed people. So the complaint this week in a newspaper was there's a lot of snobbish foreign professors who don't want to learn Finnish, whereas a lot of unemployed immigrants that are learning. So you've got a lot of cleaners now, they learn Finnish when they're unemployed because there's a scheme there for them. They get a job and then they can speak Finnish as a cleaner, as a taxi driver. But the professors can't speak Finnish, therefore the professors are kind of out of touch and removed. Anyhow, I think that this is a topic for the left. The left could simply say, we're going to provide, free language tuition to foreign people, regardless of whether they're unemployed, whether they're workers. But the left just say this isn't a topic for us. Do you see where I'm getting to now?
Mhm.
The left don't want to touch the topic because the topic of foreigners speaking Finnish is a right-wing topic. But I don't understand why it has to be, because if you care principally about people, community, then surely that becomes a left-wing topic. So yeah.
Yeah, in America, this gets even more pronounced for things like being honest about the ineffectiveness of public education. Like the left won't touch that for the most part. Um, um, the the problems of and some of them are left wing. I think should be inherent left wing issues. One of the problems that we have is in the United States is we use the educational system as our only social safety net for children, which also means that there's a bunch of contradictory impulses and stuff put on teachers. And while occasionally you'll get leftists to admit that, like, okay, we're asking people to be, teachers, guardians, in some cases, literally in my state, uh, every school has a volunteer guardian who gets a one-time payment of $600 and carries a gun on them. True facts. And there is not a lot of discourse on the left about what to do about that because talking about, for example, administrative bloat in elementary schools and high schools. We talk about it in colleges, but in elementary schools and high schools, this seems to be beyond the pale. And I say that just because this is my field and I know it very well, and I don't see leftists talk about it ever.
Mhm.
And it is talked about on the right, and often sometimes I listen to right wingers, and when they're diagnosing the problem, I'm like, well, they're actually talking about something very real. Their answers to it are insane, but they are talking about a real
Yeah.
problem. Um, and what I see on the left is like talk about gun violence in schools, which is bad here. I mean, compared to Europe, it's like exponentially bad. However, as I like to remind people, you are still way, way, way more likely to get hit by lightning than you are to be in a school shooting. Like um the number of school shootings here is quite severe, and they're actually not, while they're presented in the media presents them mostly as these big event school shootings that are random. Most of them are actually tied into the stuff that you would expect shootings to be tied into, which is like botched drug deals or fighting lovers or whatever. um and that isn't discussed. And then the other thing that people kind of pick up on is, and the right makes good use of this actually, is that the left of the a lot of the reason why is it seems like, well, the Democrats, and I don't mean the left here, but the Democrats have a strong support base amongst the administrators, so they're not going to go after that. And it seems like for some reason the left in America follows the Democratic lead without even thinking about it. Like it's a very interesting problem, and I've wondered what social media and politicized identity does for that, because it seems like there's this oppositional orientation where where the resentment sticks up, and you just won't even look at issues that are legitimately brought up because of who brought it up first, you know.
Well, this
So
is true. Yeah, yeah. And there are subjects which are simply right wing or left wing subjects, or even better, we've already kind of said that, but taking it on a bit, there are problems which are right wing problems or left wing problems. And it's like, well, society has problems. You know, you can't have only right wing or left wing, or either right wing or left wing problems. And what side you're on dictates which problems you're going to think about or admit to existing. So there is a problem there. And how do we get there? I think it's a lot tied into going back to the book, our insecurities. We are frightened of, I mean, if you look into Adorno, Hegel, Marcuse, you get this kind of, we're frightened of nature, which is kind of, it's hard to relate to in a way. You have to kind of be fairly habituated to German philosophy or philosophy generally to go along with that. Because, of course, we're not really generally frightened of nature as we understand it, because we're not frightened day to day of, even if you have hurricanes in Florida, you're not walking around thinking, I'm frightened of hurricanes, I'm frightened of volcanoes or tigers or whatever. You know, you're frightened of illness and injury and dying. And this has a profound effect on us constantly. And what we try and do is we try and make ourselves stronger than the threat constantly. So you get a point of subjugating our surroundings, subjugating nature, subjugating therefore each other. So this is where it gets into forming identities. Because to subjugate, you need to have sides, and you need to decide who's the enemy. So this is where in the book it says that the left wing needs to basically overcome its fear of nature, and I put it quite bluntly in the book as the fear of death. So it ends up being a book quite a lot about death, which is not really what I intended. I don't know how it's going to hit the sales, but yeah, there's a lot of talk about death in there, and what I say is that there's this quote we associate with Che Guevara, but it was used by a lot of socialists in South America, still is, there's socialism or death. So, you know, we want socialism or we're going to die trying, which is all good and well, though it's not very applicable to the Western situation at the moment, because that's just not how we're going to achieve anything right now. Because I
because
just
we
think,
would very quickly die. I just
yeah, yeah, the odds are very much against us. Let's just say that. So then, you know, I say what would be more useful would be this line: socialism and or death. By that I mean
Mm.
the socialism that comes about is going to have to accept death, because it's actually our fear of death which is driving capitalism. It's our insecurity which is driving us to try and fight nature, which ends up with us fighting each other. So we need basically to become more comfortable with the conditions of existence. It won't make death go away, but it might help to bring about socialism, is my point.
Yeah, I was thinking about that a little bit because I've thought about the evolution of socialist slogans. You have the "Oh, one socialism or barbarism," and World War II happened, so we got barbarism. You have socialism or death, and a lot of Latin American socialists are dead, so I guess I got death. And and then you have socialism or extinction, and I'm like, please don't make us pick the wrong side of that one. But I'm also thinking about, I was reading your book. Actually, I was thinking about Norman O'Brown a lot. Uh, uh, the terror management theorist, and it
Okay, yeah.
the and I kept thinking about the way that is used and capitalist social reproduction, like the way in which extending, people have superficially noticed, the capitalism obsession with youth, but what is that actually about? Like it's about manipulating our natural fear of death, and what that means, and you know trying to freeze natural life cycles. And I do think there's a way in which that is used against us in ways that makes us like miss how much death is actually around. I mean, in the United States, we can talk about violent deaths, but you can also just talk about the fact that, like, um, for a great majority of the population who are blue collar here, which is like 60% of the population, the way it's defined by liberals, um, their lifespan has either stalled in the case of oppressed minority groups like Black and Latin people, or it has dropped in the case of, like, quote, white unquote working class people, where there is a closing of the gap, but it's all negative. Like it's all a race to the bottom. Um, and it is amazing to me how little I actually see that discussed, even amongst people who are supposedly really interested in working class politics, because it's like there's a reason why this populism stuff really works, because in these people's daily lives, um, they're just seeing people dying younger of all kinds of stuff. And it actually ties a little bit into the fourth chapter of your book, because one of the major increases of death, we always call them death by despair, but let's like be quite honest about what they are. It's death by alcoholism and addiction, which has gone up pretty dramatically. And I often feel like that's a place where the left doesn't have a lot to say. And when it does have something to say, it's like unrealistic teetotaler stuff, like just everybody live a perfectly clean life. But most of the time doesn't say much about it at all.
Yep.
The
Well, I
stuff
mean,
about alcoholism.
there's a fairly, yeah. I mean, there is the acid communist movement, if it can be called that, is largely online. So that the response recently, as far as there is one, is that we can take psychedelics, and that will lead to a healthier outlook. But I'm not convinced by that, as I say in the book. So
Mm,
it might work individually for a while, but it doesn't scale up societally. Okay, so we could scale up potentially, but there's no government who's going to scale it up. No government that's going to get in power in the West is going to scale up psychedelic use so that every depressed person can undergo a psychedelic treatment. Of course, you can just take psychedelics on your own, but the results will be very mixed. Um, but yeah, in terms of conversations about alcoholism, yeah, it's not something really covered by the left or by critical theorists. I mean, Eric Fromm talked a bit about addiction actually, and it's certainly suggested by Marcuse, and he talks about how we're kind of given false desires, and then we're given the kind of
mm,
resolution of that desire. So capitalism, it manufactures false desire, then it makes you believe you've been satiated, but when the desire was never really, it wasn't a good desire in the first place. Um, I guess addiction links to that, but yeah, I mean, there's a big problem. Yeah, I think I don't know if you get this in America still. Young people go to university often far away from their hometowns in Britain. It's actually getting less common with the introduction of bigger and bigger tuition fees. But people kind of suddenly at 18 in the UK are kind of let loose, and they're sent packing. And of
mm.
course, that has a big impact. And people kind of find solace, or they adjust through alcohol and drugs a lot of the time. So I don't know why that really exists, that mechanism, because now it's about 50% of people go to university at around 18 or so. So it's definitely like a societal rite of passage, or if not a rite of passage, it's a thing that you make people do because it's somehow, conducive to the functioning of a capitalist society. But
Yeah.
in any case, it produces alcoholics and other kinds of addicts.
So in America, that was pretty common until very recently. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen a massive drop off of particularly young men going to college. They pretty much don't now.
Right.
Um, and that is, we're different than a lot of the developed world, and that is gendered so strongly here. And what we're finding is blue collar boys just don't think college has anything to offer them. But also 10% of them aren't working. And this transition of lifestyle that we used to see that was associated with college binge drinking, right? That was a big phenomenon in the 80s, 90s, and aughts here. Um, we're actually seeing that without the college. People are just turning 18 and going through a period of massive consumption. And that is cross class too. It is not one class doing it. I guess the upper middle class does it less, but it's kind of across the board. It's across genders, but it's more associated with men. And you've seen increasing signs of complications from alcoholism, in early life. And I was interested in it though, because one of the things that you get into why acid communism and ego death was really important does seem to be like, this is the capitalism giving you a desire uh you don't really actually have, and replacing it with something really socially and personally destructive. But also, I do think part of the reason why they can sell you that desire is there is a real desire of which they are shifting, related to ego identity and the burdens of that. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I think your book actually, even though you didn't explicitly make this argument, links those two things in a way I haven't linked them before. Um,
Well, yeah, I mean, I ran a platform called the Acid Left with Adam Ray Adkins, who's a
mhm,
poet and artist based in Florida. And then I had too much happening. I had a child and university job, and I gave over to Adam, or I left, and Adam carried on running it, and then he stopped after a while. I think we both just found that whatever we were trying to say, we weren't really saying it. We were just getting absorbed into the algorithm and concerned about the viewing figures, etc.
mhm,
But we ran it for a while, and obviously with a name like Acid Left, people assume that you're very pro psychedelics. As it happened, Adam was more pro than I was. What I saw in Acid Communism, which was a book that Mark Fisher began, but he died before finishing it. You can read the introduction online and in the K-Punk uh, book, which is a collection of Fisher essays. So you can find it. Basically, in the introduction, we don't know really where it's going, but we can try and guess. Um, he suggests that there was a strong kind of trend towards a breaking down of social boundaries and traditions in the UK in the 60s and 70s, which was very much linked to music and a diffusion of psychedelic culture throughout society. But he very much said it was psychedelic culture, not just psychedelics, as in it wasn't just because people were taking LSD. He didn't suggest you had to take LSD. He was suggesting that something in the music hinted at an erosion of previously existing rigid traditions and codes in the UK, codes of behavior. And he actually
mhm,
talks about the limit experience there, which is a term coming down from Foucault and Bataille before Foucault. And the limit experience means a experience which could be led by psychedelics, but it could be led by meditation, could be led by physical activity, by artistic endeavor or artistic practice, or other, I should say. But it leads to a kind of dissolution of the normal, what is suggested there is a normal subject object boundary, so a normal boundary between the individual and the world around them. So, this in itself can produce experiences where you're no longer fighting the natural object, or you're no longer fighting death, we could say, using the kind of vocabulary I've been using in the book. So that's all good, but I just don't see how we could claim that that's going to come about on a societal level through the taking of psychedelics. And I actually did worry when I ran the Acid Left channels that kids were going to go and do psychedelics because we're kind of we kind of made this sound okay. But actually, I tended to be saying on most of our broadcasts that this was really as much about art and meditation practices and activities like that. But in the book, I say, well, it's not like acid's going to suddenly change society. There's a drug that's having a huge impact on society. It's alcohol, and it's very
Yep.
present. And whenever acid is present, the alcohol is nearly always present in the same space anyway. So at the end of a Saturday morning, so people have gone out Friday night, getting into 4 o'clock in the morning. There's a couple of people lying down in the pavement looking at the stars because they're taking LSD, and there's also a load of people vomiting and eating kebabs and getting in fights because they've drunk alcohol. So I suppose I was just trying to make it look. I was just trying to like put it in perspective that we're not. This isn't going to happen like that, and there's not going to be any massive. How do you call it? Ego death movement. Although ego death is to some degree desirable, that's not a system. Ego death basically just means what I just went through with the limit experience. You somehow through drug taking, meditation, physical activity, you lose your ego momentarily. That's good by analogy because you lose it momentarily, you return back to your normal ego state, and you think, well, something happened there that was interesting. What if I can make that happen all the time and for all of society? Well, great thinking, but we all thought that smoking pot when we were 14 or whenever we
Right.
were doing that first, and it didn't manifest. It's not going to manifest. We need a more realistic reckoning with the conditions of our existence, and then to kind of try and build community from that. But sorry, I don't think I answered exactly what you asked, but that was kind of my thinking there.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the concept of living experience, right? I first encountered it in Bataille. It also shows up in Carl Jasper's, which means it has two kind of genealogical uses. One is the Bataille Foucault Blanchot uh, lineage. The other, weirdly, is in pop Buddhist philosophy, going back to Buddhists using Carl Jaspers, like hippie Buddhists using Carl Jaspers. So you occasionally see a concept like limit experience. Also, it isn't that exact word. I think they often call it like uh, um, uh, I'm forgetting what Jack Cronfield calls it, but he's describing the vague sense of ego death that's temporary that a Bataille is describing. Actually, like if you read, and I don't like Jack Cronfield as a Buddhist philosopher, but if you read like After the Ecstasy, the Laundry, it's about having to come down from a limit experience. And it's funny that you bring up meditation because that's what they all say to do that with, right? Is you use meditation to achieve an Atman, which is the realization of the non-permanent, uh, the non-permanence of self. And I was thinking of reading your book about this, uh, the way in which that stuff shows up in Lacanian reappropriations of it, particularly through Bataille, and how that gets tied into a kind of some of the few things we get outside of, say, Wilhelm Reich, um, about those kinds of experience in critical theory, because critical theory by and large doesn't actually, for the most part, except through Bataille and occasionally Foucault and Deleuze, touch that stuff. It's not something that's usually in the critical theorist realm of, I would say, like understanding of experience, or if it is, like in Adorno, there's a strong distrust of it, um, even though Adorno is also very interested in undoing what he calls identity thinking. But identity thinking for him doesn't mean like, it doesn't mean the way we think about it, just like as identitarian thinking. It means like identification with a position at all. Like
Mhm.
if you go through like negative dialectics. So I was very interested in that, and your own stuff about acid communism, because I did get the feeling. I mean, you guys picked up that banner, and a lot of people around uh, Matt Cushman picked up Matt Chrisman picked up that banner, and I do sometimes worry the same thing you do, because I'm like, yeah, using psychedelics and self-dosing by yourself, I'm not a prude, and I wouldn't say that there's anything necessarily wrong with doing it. But if you're mixing it with alcohol and other substances, which, as you mentioned, is extremely easy to do, it can have all kinds of effects way beyond any kind of limit experience. And so, um,
For
the,
sure. I mean, it's very unpredictable. If you're at all prone to psychosis or what's the term I'm looking for? Hypomania. So
mhm.
not full on bipolar mania, but something approaching that, which many people get, but many people have moments of hypomania. So like intense kind of thoughts, intense energy. Um, yeah, if you do acid and you're prone to hypomania, that can be dangerous. I mean, if you do it on your own and you're depressive, that might not have the best effects. Um,
That's
I
true for
don't. I
meditation
think
too,
it can
by
be
the
very
way.
intense. It can be very intense for people with autism and ADHD.
Mhm.
Actually,
Yeah, it's
so yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's tricky. Yeah, I think Fisher would have hedged that a lot in his book. He would the book, if finished, would have stated that this was not really a book telling people to go and do LSD. And then the introduction is not very LSD oriented. I mean, he's talking about things like somebody recounting their experience of childhood holiday in the 60s with a radio playing in the background. What Fisher was fixated on is in that period you could have family holidays. The workers could have family holidays. So he was talking about that more than he was talking about festival culture or LSD. That's probably the strongest kind of analogy he gives or example he gives is he's actually recounting Danny Baker's a British he was a radio persona, and then he actually ends up losing his job for saying something stupid on Twitter. But Fisher has the worst luck with people he's backed. He backed Brand, and then Brand's now not well. He's kind of cancelled by official media, and he backed Danny Baker, and Danny Baker then he made a tweet of when one of the children of Harry and Meghan was born. He made a tweet of these people walking out of hospital with a monkey, and then people said, "Hang on, isn't that racist?" They told people immediately said, Danny, take it down." People were tweeting, "Take it down. Do you realize what you've just done?" And he took it down, but the damage was already done because it looked like he was saying that the kid, because it was half, well, kind of a quarter African American, would be a chimpanzee. But he said he wasn't saying that at all. I actually quite believe him. He was just saying he was taking the piss out of royalty, basically. But then he got kind of cancelled. But yeah, he recounted a family holiday, and Fisher picked up on that, and that's the image I take away from that introduction to acid communism. Um, yeah. Anyhow,
yeah, that's yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that last chapter in your book. We brought up the socialism and or death, because it does seem to be that one thing socialists need to embrace is the finitude of what we do, which is why what we do is important. Like if life is limited, and we know that death is part of the cycle, then um the life stultifyingness of capitalism is, and in its refusal to acknowledge death, even in the midst of actual genocide, um and the fact that it can render, I mean, this was way before. This is way after your book was written. So this is not a critique that's not in there. But I think about the way in which, like, war porn, uh, on both the IDF side and unfortunately in the Gaza, and showing the the other horrors that are happening to Gazan children. I mean, I've seen uh, more dead children on social media than in the last year. Uh, than in than any time since the Iraq War, and actually probably way more. Um, and I've been thinking about that because on one hand, raising consciousness about the war, whatever, that's important. On the other hand, there's a risk of that reducing that life to something that you can like consume, and you feel the horror of war. You might give 5, 10, $20 to one of those Palestinian aid GoFundMe's, and then it's over. You don't feel like you have any other responsibility for that, because in some ways there's not a lot you can do, right? And I was thinking about what that last chapter has to say about that, because that element of the repurposing of social rebellion is one of the most horrifying things, which is like the fact that we can even repurpose and denude the meaning of actual atrocity through presentation, because clearly that is happening, right? And a lot of people are very motivated about it, but as I pointed out, you can't be on social media and not be exposed to that. It doesn't have the effect that people are hoping.
Yeah. I generally don't think it's a great idea to try and counter horror with images of horror.
Mhm.
That's a very Adornian point, but I often end up agreeing with Adorno. Adorno has his whole "there can be no art after Auschwitz," which is often kind of misread. He just means in a society that's gone that far towards barbarism, there can't be art in that society. They already is the artistic moment is kind of gone. Um, but yeah, he also said that images of horror play back into the same horror. Um, and I tend to agree. I also think we need to know what's going on. But I just try and think of, I'm trying to get into the mindset of people who share those images, apart from the people who actually firsthand saw the atrocities, who can share the images to say, "I saw this," which is actually a tendency that goes back to Goya. Goya made this print in which he wrote, "I saw this." It came from the Peloponnesian War, was it, in Spain? Um, I believe it was
Mhm.
1700s. He made an etching of a torso that had been slung, slung on a tree, like tied to a tree, but the limbs had been lopped off. And he'd seen it, and he was shocked by that. So he wrote on the thing in Spanish, in the Spanish of the time. So I don't remember actually the phrase it said, but in English it is, "I saw this." And of course, that's very powerful, and it's the kind of basis of today's photojournalism. Um, but when it's other people who didn't see it, it becomes something different. So they didn't see it first; they're just sharing it, often to reinforce their solidarity with the Palestinian movement, or whichever movement it is. Um, but I wonder to what degree people doubt their solidarity, and this is the real thing happening. That people do not feel empowered generally today. People feel insecure, as they always do, and by posting the image again and again, it's another form of selfie posting or posting about politics. It shores up their identity. It makes them feel like they're real, but of course it's not going to work for very long. They're gonna have to keep doing it. So you get people who are almost like, well, if you're not posting, they then transfer onto other people. If you're not posting about Palestine, you're anti-Palestinian. If you're not posting about Palestine, you're pro-Israeli. If you're not posting about Palestine, you're liberal, capitalist, and pro-war. And you kind of feel that that's what they must feel about themselves as well. So in a way, they've lost. There's no victory in doing that, and aside from the fact of whether we can stop the war or not, they, as people in faraway countries that have the freedom and liberty to do anything, become reduced to these constant reposters of dark imagery. So it's almost the worst outcome, because it's like, well, you would think that maybe they'd be like, well, hey, I've got my freedom. I'm going to do this with it. Not, I've got my freedom. I'm going to get stuck in a loop of horror posting. you know,
Right.
where doing this rather than horror posting would be perhaps a street movement, but anything that builds community in your area, no, not ending up in some nihilist despair in front of a computer. So I think I guess by saying that I'm kind of agreeing with your sentiment there.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I worry about because I think the people who do this are doing it for the right reasons. But I also think, like, man, if you haven't gotten the point after seeing one dead baby, you're not going to get it after seeing 500 either.
Yeah, yeah, but also I totally agree with their reasons, but their
Right, me
reasoning
too.
might be fine. That might be fine, but yeah, you just said you did. I'm saying yeah, I also do, but it doesn't mean that there's not something unhealthy in what they're doing
Absolutely.
for
I,
themselves.
I mean, it's a you know atrocity exhibition is one of those things that always you know I think about it going all the way back to the work of J.G. Ballard, which I know this is a very abstract intellectual way of thinking about it, but also as a person who's worked, I worked in Egypt for a while with kids who survived both uh, one or the other intifadas and people who were running out of Yemen from the civil war there, and um, trying to work with kids who had seen that stuff at like age 6 or 7, and the last thing they really want to do is to be uh, constantly reminded of it, even though they definitely want those wars to end, and they definitely want people to understand what they went through, and that's always in the back of my mind when I see these images because I'm like, well, I don't want to get on the whole like trauma train because you and I both know that is a psychological concept that has been abused by capitalist management to the point of almost being useless, even though I think it's a pretty valid psychological concept.
Mhm.
Um, I, I do think there's a way in which we have to kind of like, is this having the effect you think it does, or is this like proving to yourself that you care because you're exposing yourself to this horror all the time? And I wonder about that, not just in specific context, but when the way I sometimes get in arguments with people about anti-imperialism, not because I impose anti-imperialism, I absolutely don't, but because I'll try to say to someone, "Hey, even liberation from genocide is not in and of itself a positive politics, right?" And people just respond as if I'm critiquing the idea that we should end genocide, and I'm just like, no, like there's just stopping a genocide tells you nothing about what happens afterwards at all, like. So, like, as a politics, that is a good negative politics, but it is just a negative politics. And negative politics will never be good enough in the sense that all kinds of people can appropriate and reappropriate it, including capitalists. And I mean, the commodification of anti imperialism and the right wingification of anti imperialism is something we should be able to see. And yet, like trying to get people to think about it is really really difficult, and the reason why is I think it actually damages their sense of self. Like if that's not enough, and I don't like, because the reason why is when I go, okay, we don't have a positive politics right now, right? We know that we need to stop this horrible thing from happening, but that's all we got, right? That, and whether you like it or not, I'm not going to say that's a reactionary politics because reactionary has moral implications, but it is a reactive politics. It is not a politics about a greater vision.
Yeah, yeah, it is. But crucially, that this is just an outcome of capitalism, or arguably.
Hmm.
So, to kind of be constantly alarmed at what's happening as if it's a surprise. I mean, I know it's a new modality in many ways of conducting warfare. There have been some new kind of things trialed, like exploding devices and AI selection of targets. But just the sheer brutality um, in front of I would say, of the world's media, but in front of social media. It's something new, which beckons perhaps a dark, an even darker reality. Um, but it's still an outcome of capitalism. So, the constant alarm on in terms of why is this happening is misguided, and you're correct. Yeah, that there should be a wider anti-capitalist movement or socialist movement.
Yeah. Um,
I mean, I think people kind of feel that that is to hijack. That's hijacking what's a humanitarian cause. That could be one argument, but I don't think so. I think that this is very much an issue of capitalism, and no doubt the military-industrial complex. So it's about selling weapons. It's about rebuilding contracts, same as Ukraine. So yeah, this shouldn't be seen as an aberration whereby we need reminding every day what horror looks like. That it seems to me that those people, they're somehow alarmed because they haven't put the pieces together completely. I mean, some of them, or surely many of them, because they're not allowed to put the pieces together because we keep getting stopped. The media stops us from understanding, basically.
yeah, I mean, it compartmentalizes it, or um, the underlying logics are left are seen. I think today, even on the left, is seen solely as a function of geopolitics and not as a function of political economy. Um, and I don't think you can actually separate those two things out. And so it's and again, I mean, it's horrifying. I mean, having seen some of that stuff, I mean, I've seen some of it close up, like not even online. And it's um it's not something that's easy to deal with, but it's also something that I think we as communists have to, do more than just say we're going to stop this one event. We have to go, okay, we're not just going to stop this one event. How do you organize the world so this doesn't happen? Period.
Hmm.
Right? Because the specific of it, a lot of the problems with these responses to atrocities is the specific atrocity will end, right? One way or the other.
Hmm.
It might be in the worst way, but it will end. But the impetus towards atrocity has not been addressed, right?
Hmm.
And so whenever you're responding to a specific a specific atrocious traumatic event, I think about like the response to the Iraq war. There's all these kinds of incentives. Once you get one thing dealt with, our time just handles it, to miss that the underlying logic that led you there is still absolutely in play, and you can rest on your laurels. And in that sense, I do think that bourgeois social movements actually often distract from dealing with the underlying problems, which are more than just the specific geopolitical instance. And I think a lot of people have a hard time with that. I mean, I don't just think general people who encounter, I mean, like, yeah, most people who know about what's going on in Gaza are horrified by it. And you see that in public opinion polls. They also don't seem to think they have enough control over it for it to be like a major voting issue or whatever. But then I'm like, okay, let's say you did stop this specific instance, and and we absolutely should. I don't want to belittle people, but you still haven't dealt with the larger reasons why these things happen, right? Like, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
um,
So don't people think that if it was stopped, it would be because whoever's like really putting the strings? I don't mean that in some kind of conspiracy thinking way, but wouldn't it be because elite powers were ready to stop it now?
yeah,
So they're ready to stop it now. Okay, well that doesn't mean they're not ready to start again whenever they want, or to start again elsewhere, which is effectively what you're saying. Um,
I mean, it's not like ended. It's not like, even if you accept the narrative, the protesters ended the Vietnam War, which I don't. I think the Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong ended the Vietnam War. But even if you accept that narrative, it didn't end war, right? At all.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
In fact, it got worse after it, not better.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's something to think about. one of the things that the last little bit, and this will be my last question or rumination that get you started on, but I was thinking about the current attempt to live stream communism. Like we've seen a lot of that. It's led to some weird political formations in the United States in particular. But it seems to me, and I say this as a person talking to you on a podcast, it's going to be broadcast on YouTube, so I completely get the self implication in this. That a lot of that stuff presents itself as politics because they see politics as, awakening people to the situation, but it's actually a form of entertainment that binds us up into capitalist logics effectively. I
Yeah.
wanted your thought on that because
I-
it's like the last thing you talk about in the book. So
Yeah, I talk about it in this book, and I've talked about it in previous books. I've been one of the most consistent people saying this from our,
yeah, you have.
very online left. Yeah, I mean, it's totally the case that this is kind of an industry. It's a very small subsection of the online realm. Generally, is a very small byproduct of the online realm democratizing published expression, democratizing publishing and broadcasting, which it has done. I mean, democratizing carries all kind of connotations around electoral systems. So let's say horizontalizing, making it possible for more and more people to broadcast and publish their thoughts, which is a great thing. But its kind of main output, it's things like cat memes and selfies, suggestive selfies. That the the left wing is a very small part of that. So I think we overimagine or overestimate our reach often. There's certainly some positivity in the sense that people are talking about Marx. They're talking about the Frankfurt School. Of course, some people who talk about Marx think you shouldn't be talking about the Frankfurt School, but in any case, people are talking about different left wing theorists and thought currents. But there is a sense that, well, for one, we're playing into algorithms, and that does a number of things. It makes money for the capitalist system very directly. You might make money for yourself if you have a Patreon, but you're also making money for these huge platforms. And it also means that these platforms and whoever's reading the information, they basically know they know your thoughts. There's various different ways that functions, which can be dangerous depending on who takes power and what they want to do with the data. But also, we have a number of figures in our midst who are just hell-bent on their own success and fame and enrichment, and don't seem to have a very core kind of communist belief in the way they behave towards other people. And I think sometimes that gets kind of obscure because people say, well, we can't behave in a communist way until we achieve communism. So for now, we have to behave in a very hierarchical way, and they treat it like a type of vanguardism. So yeah, you get a situation which you get in the left cultural fields generally. You get it in art museums, you get it in art galleries. You get this kind of appropriation of leftist images, but the actual system is very much a hierarchical capitalist one. So we definitely have that problem, but we do have a lot of good people as well. Some of them, unfortunately, they get too wrapped up in the numbers, and you think, are they really thinking about the right thing? So some smart young person comes along, starts YouTubing, and then the next thing you see them a couple of years later, and all they're talking about is their figures. And you thought, well, you used to talk about Marx a lot more, That is,
Are they talking about whatever's trending on X or Twitter that day or whatever?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's what's trending, and then they're going to make a video on that. But I don't want to be super cynical because I can count like quite a few people I've met through this medium doing what we do, who are really sound, and they're the ones I tend to engage with, to be honest.
yeah, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. But as a person who used to really believe, I mean, and it hasn't been true for a long time, but I was like, oh, we have media, we can get these ideas out now, and I'm not this lone weirdo in the middle of nowhere. Um, at the same time, it can lead you to over represent your numbers to chase clout. And also, honestly, today, I mean your book doesn't talk about this, but those numbers aren't trustworthy. Like, the amount of bots and view buying and stuff that can go into this to also juke your stats mean that, like, um you can create this sense that you have way more of an audience than you do. And you meet people who are internet famous, and you talk to people just around the water cooler, if such a thing still exists at your job. It actually does in mine. um and you realize nobody has any idea about any of this shit. It's just there's not just that they don't know you or your stream, that they don't even know about the culture at all.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh yeah, these mass aggregations of culture, that even if you assume they're not bots, it might be thousands of people, but they're so diffuse that there's not a community there really. And yet, I do believe that most of the polling that indicates that, like, left-wing ideas, when you don't say that they're left-wing, are very popular. They're already popular even amongst conservative minding people, as long as you don't call them socialism or whatever.
That's true.
um so it just makes me it makes me wonder about the purpose of all this. But yeah, I've definitely seen the other thing is there's a lot of people who've been good people who get caught into the numbers. I think one of the big dangers, and I think this is a danger not just in streaming, I think this is a danger for activists too, is if you make this your living, um, the incentives are bad for you to actually try to figure out how to solve the problem. Because if you solve the problem, unless you really, really solve the problem, like you had a revolution, everybody benefits, you actually lose your stream of income. Like, so it has a really set of perverse incentives in it. And I was really like, I felt validated by the last line of your chapter, which we have nothing to lose but our audience. And I was like, yeah, sometimes I think, if you're going to be an honest leftist and operate in this world, you have to be willing to lose your audience, or otherwise you're going to go in very strange places. You cannot be captured by your audience, because uh in an Adornian sense, and I don't mean this in the negative Adornian sense of like everything is bad, I mean this, we all live in this society and it affects us even if we think we see through it. That sense of things from Adorno, and I think he's right about that. That there's not a way to be a little isolated island outside of society who just, I see through the imperialism, I see through the capitalism or whatever. A lot of people do. That doesn't matter. That's already factored in. People have seen through it from the beginning. Like, um, the thing is, can you build a community that can do something beyond that? And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen through streaming. That's a very uh, ideas that cannot be embodied are basically entertainment. So,
Yeah.
um,
Um, well, I don't know if I see it coming through streaming. I think if we check our behavior a bit, if we try and stick to what it is we're trying to do and don't get distracted, and we're honest with ourselves, if we're kind of going wayward and we become all about the numbers and the money, if we can be honest with ourselves, we can do a lot better, and then maybe we can use these platforms to try and get people to meet up in real life, a bit more.
mhm,
But I'm not a great organizer in that sense. I have ideas. In organizing, a lot of organizing is having different people in the right roles. So, we some people are just broadcasters. They're very good broadcasters. So I'd be unfair. It'd be unfair if I was to put pressure on and say those people should be on the picket lines, or organize or trade union organizing, and the writers have their role as well. But I think within that, there's enough people interested in this kind of way in left wing politics to to organize, to get the right people doing the right thing, and maybe we can have a sense of community again. But yeah, who's going to kind of step in and make that happen? Because I'm a writer.
Right. Uh, yeah, as a writer, teacher, and union guy, I will tell you that weirdly, even though I do all of those things from the same moral political impulses, they don't overlap at all. Like at all. Like, it's just I actually feel very weirdly segmented in the way that I interact with all this. And the media is good for getting these ideas out, but like I will say, for example, if I'm doing something with a union action, I would never use my show for that. And one of the reasons why is like my audience isn't primarily where I live. It's just,
Mhm.
the case. I have, my audience is in like Toronto, New York, and Stockholm, Sweden, and Manchester and London, almost as much as I mean, definitely more than it is in Utah, where I actually live. I mean, and so it just wouldn't be useful for that even. And so thinking about the function and structure of media and what it can do and what it can't do really seems important if you want to use it to build communities, because there's certain things like there's certain communities and international relations and networks that I could build, but I can't actually help a union action here with it. And that's something that I think a lot about. And the other thing I think about that you brought up is I'm dependent on capitalist media organizations that are privatized and making money off me. I try to resist it in some ways. I deliberately sabotage my SEO and my SEO. People don't realize I do that, but I do. And I don't monetize my YouTube. But at the same token, like I'm still totally dependent on them. They could cut me off at any moment for any damn reason.
Yeah,
Um,
well, that's true. Yeah, but I think, yeah, we both teach,
mhm,
and that makes things in a way, it makes things easier. It's a weird thing to say, but because we're not completely reliant on platforms. Because some people are completely reliant on platforms. I actually, even if they're earning what I'm earning, I kind of feel sorry for them. You know,
oh yeah,
I kind of feel a
and
I feel a freedom because I have a job that gives me a freedom to get my stuff done. Even in my job, I teach in university. I teach academic writing, some kind of
mhm.
communication type themes. Um, It's not really what I write about. It is related, but it still gives me, it enables me to write what I do. You know.
Yeah, I think as a high school teacher, there's a little bit more tension between my writing and what I teach, but it does enable me to have a certain freedom to not. If I have a bad week on Patreon, I'm still going to be able to pay my rent, and so if I say something that's unpopular because I think it's true, there's very little that would stop me from saying it. The thing that I often consider that stops me from saying things these days is not money. It's actually other people's responses. Like, what am I going to, how are other people going to respond to what I say? Are they going to understand it, or is it going to put them in a corner and cause them to react against it? And I do think as communists, we should think a lot more about that latter when we talk to people, and a lot less about like whether or not it's going to be popular. It's more like, am I framing? It's not so much a matter of like what I say, although it does affect it, but am I framing the message in a way that I can be honest and not also put people in a situation where they can only respond against me? And that,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. But I think sometimes if you can tweet, if one can tweet,
mm,
and then yeah, you might check in sometimes to see what people have said, but it doesn't really matter.
yeah,
You're not getting like really worked up about, oh shit, people are angry. Okay, so 100 people get pissed off at a tweet. It's not really going to affect me because it's not affecting my bottom line. It's not.
right.
That's important. So that's the kind of contradiction where a job gives you freedom, and then it's kind of unclear what Marx had in mind from a utopian society when he has this. idea of you can be hunting in the morning and fishing in the afternoon and critiquing over dinner in the evening. But he certainly thinks you'd be doing stuff, you know.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean, that's
you
absolutely
you
true.
had to be working. So the hunting and the fishing he describes, well, that's so you get food. You don't get to do nothing. You still got to go and get your food. And then that is what makes it possible to eat dinner. And then he says critiquing at dinner, which sounds odd, but I think he means talking about politics over dinner. You're intellectualizing over dinner, but you've only done that because you worked in the day. It might be
Right.
casually, you do some hunting here, you do some fishing here. Sounds kind of nice, but you're still working, you know?
Right.
And I think that's reasonable, you know?
Yeah, I mean, socially necessary labor is still labor. Um, it might not be. I mean, we could get into the semantic distinction whether or not it's work, because a lot of people, a lot of anti-workers will, you know, when you really push on what they're saying, they're actually not saying that there won't be work, except for like the fully automated luxury communism
Yeah,
people.
well,
But
there is, but there's so much of what passes for communism now is a fully automated luxury variety that's really kind of infiltrated how people think about communism.
yeah, yeah, and that, well, yeah, that worries me for a variety of reasons, because that actually is a relationship of dependency. Like if you're concerned about ending classes, and you're concerned about people being able to actualize their own life in a way that is responsible and doesn't exhaust all of our resources, etc., but still has the freedom to do so, then making us all super dependent on automation is a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Um, uh, because the thing about automation is you still need people doing something somewhere. um, and I don't think you get around that by.
Yeah, exactly. And you need people owning it. And okay, so they're talking about communism, so there'll be no owners. But where are they? How are they getting there? Whilst you're also fully automating everything, because I think at some point people who own the stuff that are fully automating everything are going to think, well, we don't need these, 8 billion people in the way. We've got machines that can do everything, and we can have a much nicer, greener planet without all these other people. So, if you're basically not needed for production, you're superfluous. And the whole of history shows us that the ruling elite don't mind just getting rid of people who are superfluous
Yep.
to production and to their wealth. So there's a big bit there missing. And I don't know how some fairly smart people have managed to not see that, unless they're just not as cynical as I am. But I don't think it's just cynicism. I think it's just a grasp of history.
Yeah, the removal of surplus peoples, um, is, and by surplus I don't mean like unnecessary socially. I mean unnecessary for profits, before people misunderstand what I'm saying here. Um, I mean that's why there's such a big prison industrial prospect in the United States. And I'll also tell you, like, if you want to commit a genocide, the best way to do it, and actually we see this in Palestine and Israel, is to not allow a population to work with you and make them completely superfluous to your social existence. That, like, once you see that, you can almost be like, oh, something exterminationist is going to come down the line pretty soon. Um, and so we should always be looking out for that. I'd like to thank you so much for your time, Mike. I know it's probably getting a little bit into the evening where you're at over there across the planet, and uh, the Finnish speaking zones. And just to commiserate with you, I tried to learn Korean, which is a language that is somewhat similar to Finnish, and apparently it's really easy to learn if it's your first language. But if it's not your first language, and you're not a speaker of languages that work that way, of which Finnish is actually similar to Korean. I mean, there was a theory for a long time that I think has now been pretty much abandoned, but that they were somehow related on the Asian steppes. But uh, those languages are really hard to learn for me. Um, uh, I can speak Korean in a restaurant, but if you ask me to actually formulate a sentence in a way that makes any sense, I can't.
Yeah,
Um,
my son speaks Finnish and English. He's 3,
uh,
but he's equally as adept in both. So I learned some Finnish statements and things that are said to him. So like
mhm.
"Nukama aita," Nugamaita means bedtime now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but this is not much use in a social context, with
Right.
anyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of solder in there because I definitely feel that. Anyway, thank you so much. We'll be seeing more from you and your authors. I would tell people to read most of your books. They're all short and they're all super dense, but they're very readable despite being super dense. I know when I say something super dense, it sounds like it's not going to be readable, but I think you actually share a trait with that I admired about Fisher. I often give Fisher a hard time, but I actually do think Fisher was another one of these guys who could write very clearly and very enjoyably about something and get you thinking about it in not a whole lot of pages. Like you didn't. That's not a gift I necessarily have myself. So every time I look down at an essay, I'm like, God damn it, it's 40 pages. I'm gonna have to cut this down. So it's I want to give people to go check out your book. What else is anything you'd like to plug for what you're doing or Revo or anything like that?
Just quickly, all my books are supposed to be twice as long, but I just end up getting to 90 pages and thinking I've said it all. So I had this obviously the opposite tendency to you. And I'll keep you posted on my finish learning. And then what's coming up? Well, Revolt Press have some interesting things coming up. Actually, One Dime, Tony Chamas, aka One Dime, is producing something for us on totalitarianism in a democratic state, looking at America. So that's going to be really interesting. He's just finishing that up now. Then I'll be editing that. For myself, I'm writing a book on ecology, digital culture, and the Frankfurt School for an academic press. So maybe we'll be a little bit different, called the Anthem Press, based in the UK. And yeah, we have other things coming from Revolt Press, including your book eventually when you're ready. Yeah,
when I'm ready. I should have some essays for you soon. I have about 5 different essays that are in various states of being unfinished.
that's something we can work with. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just that people check out what Ruvo's doing. I have read your book and The Darkest Timeline, and I both thought, I both thought they're pretty good. I do worry that we might accidentally end up being considered the doomer of leftist press. But
we have started off fairly gloomy. Yeah, I don't know that One Dime's going to pick up much. I don't think the mood's going to pick up very much with One Dime. Maybe,
and I highly doubt it's going to with me either. So.
Okay, well, we'll see. We do have some other people. Let's see if anyone will come in with some kind of saving grace.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Cheers then.
Cheers.